In this video, I want to go over the IP validation problem on Codewars. And what I want you to do is to write an algorithm that will identify valid IPv4 addresses. Now, if we come over here and look at the function, we can see that they provide us a string or the IP as input. What they want us to do is to check to see if the IP in question is valid. If it is, return true. Otherwise, return false. Now, if we come over here to look at some examples of valid IPs, we can see that IPs with 4 octets, 1, 2, 3, 4 are valid. IPs with octets between 0 and 255 are also valid. So 123 is between 0 and 255. That is valid. Invalid examples will be IPs with 3 octets, IPs with 5 octets, basically IPs with octet lengths of anything but 4, IPs with octets between greater than 255, IPs with octets that have leading zeros. Now don't confuse this with A0. If this was 123.0.0.1, this would be a valid IP, but it's invalid if it's a leading zero, aka 01, 02, 03, 04. That would also be considered invalid. Some other invalid cases are IPs that contain letters of the alphabet and strings or IPs that just don't exist. Now the way we're going to solve this is we're going to create a list of octets. Every octet that they provide us in our IP will be its own element in our list. So we're going to say IP list is equal to strng.split. The delimiter will be a period. Now what this delimiter does, if we look over here, this IP list is going to be our list of octets. If we look over here, our delimiter is a period. Basically, it's what separates the elements. 123 will be its own element. 45 will be its own element, 67 will be its own element, and 89 will be its own element because the delimiter was a period, if that makes sense. The reason we do this is because it makes it much easier to work with and to check to see if it's a valid octet in our IP. So next we need to iterate throughout every octet in our IP list. So we're going to say for X in IP list. There's a couple things we need to check for, a couple test conditions. We need to see if there is a letter in our alphabet, and we need to see if there's the correct amount of IP, or the correct amount of octets in our IP. Now, since every element in our list is an octet, if the length of our list does not equal 4, that means it's an invalid IP address. So we need to check to see if there's letters in our octet. So if X is digit is equal to false, and what this does is this is digit function, it returns true if all the characters in question are integers. So it would return true here because this octet is integers. However, it would return false here because this octet has letters in it. So we've taken care of that. We need to check to see if there are 4 octets in our IP. So we say or the length of IP list does not equal 4. If any of these are the case, we're going to return false. Okay, so there's some other things we need to check for. We need to check for leading zeros. So a 0 is fine as long as it is not a leading 0. And the way we can check for this is if X dot starts with 0, remember it's still a string, 0, and the length of X, or our octet, sorry about that, length of X is greater than 1. What this means is if it starts with 0 and the length of the octet is greater than 1, and meaning this, in this case it would be 3, then we would this would be invalid because that would be a leading 0, if that makes sense. Or, so there's also something we need to check for, or it is greater than 255. So in this case, this octet is 456. That is an invalid octet. So, or X is greater than 255. But remember, our string, every octet is still a string of integers. And we cannot perform comparison checks on strings. So we have to convert this into an integer, if that makes sense. So now we can perform a comparison check on our octet. If that octet is greater than 255, that means it is invalid. Now return false. Now, if we've gone through every octet in our IP list, so X represents the octet in our IP list, and we haven't hit any of these test conditions, that means that this is a valid IP address. So we will return true. Now let us test this and see if it works. Okay, so all 338 test cases passed. That is the IP validation problem on Codewars. I hope that it was valuable and you learned something. And if you did, I would appreciate if you liked, commented, and subscribed. And I will see you guys in future tutorials.